The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. As we all know, Boko Haram has significantly accelerated its acts of mass murder and abduction in Nigeria, requiring a more robust and effective response from the government of Nigeria and friends like the United States. According to the most recent report by the Internal Displaced Monitoring Center and the Norwegian Refugee Council, there are now some 3.1 million Nigerian internally displaced persons, or IDPs, more than every other country in the world except for Syria and Colombia. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimates that there are now more than 10,000 Nigerian refugees in Niger and Cameroon. According to the International Rescue Committee, due to credible fears of abduction, as many as 1,000 refugees a week, 80% women and girls, are fleeing to the nearby country of Niger from Nigeria's Borno State alone. Former U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria, Robin Renee Sanders, testified before this subcommittee on June 11th that the fight against Boko Haram will be a long war, as she put it, but that the Nigerian military and security forces are insufficiently trained and ill-equipped to meet the challenge of a savage, relentless violence unleashed by Boko Haram. Just this morning, she told a Capitol Hill forum on Boko Haram that in the vacuum created by delays in training Nigerian forces, vigilante groups have now been formed. They've been there, but now they're growing in number, and are themselves committing human rights abuses. According to the current State Department Human Rights Report, Boko Haram is responsible for the most heinous human rights violations in Nigeria, but that same report tells us that elements of the Nigerian armed forces and security apparatus have committed serious human rights abuses as well, with little or no accountability. Even in the face of serious threats to Nigerian and regional security, the U.S. government, which has a long-standing alliance with the Federal Republic of Nigeria, has experienced some obstacles in providing the security assistance necessary to help our ally address this dire emergency. Laws our Congress created to prevent our alliance with rogue military and security forces are being blamed by some for making our assistance more difficult to provide. But is it the law? Is the law the problem? Or rather, is it how the law is being applied? Or is it that the U.S. has not attempted to train sufficient numbers of human rights vetted Nigerian forces? Or is it the Nigerians themselves not wanting that kind of training? What is the targeted number for trained Nigerians? For this year and the future, how many trainers have been committed to this task? I believe the Leahy laws are a necessary component of a prudent human rights policy, and today's hearing is in large part intended to find out whether there are legitimate obstacles to their implementation. At the outset, I'd like to make clear that I have long supported human rights vetting to allow for training of those who pass muster. One example of many, as chair of the then Subcommittee on International Operations and Human Rights, I chaired a hearing on Indonesia on May 7, 1998, featuring a man by the name of Pius Lustri Lanang, who was tortured by members of the Indonesian military amid deep concerns that those involved may have been trained under our Military Education and Training Program, or IMET. In like manner, I and others were concerned that U.S.-trained Indonesian troops may have been complicit in slaughtering people in East Timor. On a fact-finding trip to Jakarta, I sought but never received the names of specific individuals trained by the U.S., including members of the elite Kopassus unit, who slaughtered dissidents as the Suharto government fell. Similar training concerns were expressed by me and others concerning the Joint Combined Exchange Training, or JCET, and the Rwandan Patriotic Army during the period when the RPA was engaged in the killing of refugees in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Moreover, in 1999, Congress passed my legislation, and Mrs. Masmino will remember this well because she testified at several of those hearings that we had, that suspended all U.S. federal law enforcement support and exchanges with the British police force in Northern Ireland, known as the Royal Ulster Constabulary, until new human rights training programs were implemented there, and until programs were established to vet out any RUC officers who engaged in human rights abuses from benefiting from American training and preparation. The vetting legislation worked. Exchanges and training at FBI facilities for RUC officers were suspended for more than 2 years until President Bush certified that the British had established a system to vet and block anyone who committed or condoned human rights violations from the program. As my colleagues know, according to the current quadrennial defense review, we are in a time of increased danger from terrorist forces in foreign nations, while shrinking budgets force our military and security forces to become smaller and leaner. The QDR states, and I quote in pertinent part, the Department of Defense will rebalance our counterterrorism efforts towards greater emphasis on building partnership capacity, especially in fragile states. One manifestation of that developing policy is the President's proposal to allocate $5 billion to a new counterterrorism partnership fund. I have visited Nigeria twice in the past 9 months alone and have chaired several hearings on security in Nigeria in the past 2 Congresses alone. Just last month, I met with U.S. and Nigerian officials to find out why our security assistance has been so difficult to provide when the need is so increasingly great. Is it the process, or has the administration not sought to seriously expand training? I don't know. You will notice that the Department of State is not testifying today. That is partly because Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Tom Malinowski, was unavailable when we invited him to testify. And I know he will come at a future date, and hopefully very soon. But it may also be partly due to an abundance of caution surrounding even a discussion of difficulties experienced in implementing the Leahy laws. For example, when I was in Abuja last month, I asked our embassy to provide me with their best recommendations, and I would share it with everyone here, for making the Leahy vetting more effective so that we can provide the much-needed aid to the Nigerian government and then end the increasing slaughter and kidnapping of innocents such as the Chibok school girls. Despite initial assurances of cooperation, I have yet to receive the information, but I will keep asking. I understand that not everything that can be said publicly or should be said publicly, but again, this law was created with full transparency, passed the Senate at the behest of Senator Leahy, and has been renewed year in and year out, often with tweaks and changes to it. As my colleagues know, we refer to the Leahy laws because there are actually 2 of them, one for the Department of State and one for the Department of Defense. Together, they cover material assistance, including equipment and training. These laws require investigation of alleged human rights violations by military and security forces, including police. These investigations, performed mostly by the Department of State, require details on not only individuals but also military units. Failure to obtain such information as name and date and place of birth can sometimes prevent an investigation and put it into limbo. National government officials may consider such information an invasion of their sovereignty, although we ought to do more to convince them why that is not so, but to avoid aiding and abetting rogue elements, we must know if a perpetrator of abuse is a man from Jos or a man with the same name from Kano State, as one example. If individuals or elements of a larger force are guilty of human rights violations, entire battalions or regiments can be tainted unless the guilty are identified and separated out from those forces that are innocent of such crimes. The Leahy laws allow for the recreation of clean units. On the surface, it would seem that such a policy is clear and possible to implement. Unfortunately, it has not been so simple in practice. Despite the fact that Sarah Sewell, Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, told the full Foreign Affairs Committee on May 21st in this room that at least half of the Nigerian military and security forces are clear of allegations of human rights violations, we continue to be told that Leahy vetting is at least slowing the provision of security assistance. According to congressional testimony by Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Robert Jackson, there are an estimated 187 Nigerian military units and 173 police units that have been cleared, but very few Nigerian units have been trained or are in training today. Again, the big question, why? Our government provides approximately $15 billion in security assistance worldwide each year, involving 158 countries. Yet there are only 13 headquarters staff handling Leahy vetting, in addition to embassy personnel. Is this a sign that these laws are not being taken seriously enough by our own government, and there is a requirement for additional spending? In the current fiscal year, the Department of State is receiving $2.75 million to conduct Leahy vetting. In the newest bill, the Senate has $5 million. Perhaps that will be enough. I don't know. I would hope our distinguished witnesses will shed some light on that. Of the 158 countries we provided assistance to, 46 had some aid withheld in 2011. The typical percentage of global Leahy vettings that don't meet requirements is about 1% to 2%, with just under 10%, quote, suspended. In fiscal year 2012, according to testimony from the congressional research expert, Laura Plow, the State Department vetting 1,377 members of the Nigerian security forces, and of that figure, 85% were cleared to receive assistance, with 15% rejected or suspended. In Colombia, the government rejected the requirements of the Leahy laws before changing their minds and accepting the process. Now, there reportedly are more high-ranking Colombian military officials and officers behind bars than in any other country other than Argentina, and Colombia is cited as a Leahy law success. In Nigeria, there has been no disciplinary actions against Nigerian military for scorched earth assaults on populations, and few high-ranking Nigerian military officers have been held accountable for human rights violations. So we're here today to examine the questions that these facts raise and other facts, and our witnesses have been asked to walk us through the process, tell us what works and what doesn't, and suggest ways to make this process more effective. I'd like to now turn to my distinguished colleague, Mr. Cicilline, for any opening he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and Ranking Member Bass for calling this important and timely hearing. As we all know, the security situation in Nigeria has deteriorated seriously in recent months with the expansion of Boko Haram, which in April brazenly kidnapped hundreds of young schoolgirls. This committee and this Congress passed a resolution condemning these kidnappings, and I think we all remain committed to providing as much U.S. assistance and advice as can be effective to support the Nigerian government's efforts to secure the return of these schoolgirls and to stem the violence of this brutal and violent terrorist organization. Maintaining robust enforcement of the Leahy laws, which serves as the primary safeguard, assuring that the United States is not contributing to human rights violations through its military foreign assistance, is, I believe, a necessity if we're to maintain credibility with local populations, not to mention do the right thing by ensuring that we are not supporting or assisting those violating basic human rights. So I look forward to hearing the testimonies today, and I'm particularly interested in hearing our witnesses address how we can move forward in a constructive way to assist the Nigerian government while ensuring that the units we support honor the most basic tenets of human rights and international law. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, my friend. I'd like to yield to Mr. Pincher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to participate in this important hearing and for your 30 years of dedicated commitment to the plight of human rights and religious liberties and freedoms of conscience throughout the world. Thank you, witnesses, for appearing for us today. The purpose of this hearing clearly is very important as we work to ensure that we're taking appropriate actions to curb human rights violations around the world, while at the same time not undermining our own national security. The continued attacks aimed at the young girls, their kidnapping and selling those girls into human trafficking is the most egregious act that cannot be tolerated. In May, I sent a letter to the President, joined by over 170 of my colleagues, urging all possible action to find and protect those girls. The issue we face, however, is what actions can or should we be taking to support a foreign military who has been continually engaged in politically motivated killings, torture, and excessive use of force, or they have just been negligent in securing their country from those who engage in these egregious abuse. I look forward to your testimony as we will be considering the issue on the House floor in the coming weeks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished. Thank you. I'd like to yield to our ranking member, Karen Bass from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today, and I don't want to take a lot of time. I want to jump right into it. But I'm hoping that as part of the testimony and looking at the subject of human rights, that someone will address the issue and legislation that is occurring in regards to LGBT individuals and the way we have seen draconian legislation passed in a variety of places, and hopefully you will comment to that in your testimony.
I'd like to now introduce our distinguished witnesses, beginning with Ms. Lauren Blanchard, who is a specialist in African affairs at Congressional Research Service, where she provides analysis on African political, military, and diplomatic affairs and on U.S. policy in the region to members of Congress, committees, and staff. She has written extensively on security issues and U.S. military engagement on the continent, speaks regularly at academic institutions and in international policy fora in the United States and abroad, and has conducted training in various countries across Africa for parliamentarians and other government officials on the policymaking role of the Congress. Previously, she worked at USAID as well as in the United States Senate. We'll then hear from Colonel Peter Aubrey, who is currently the president of Strategic Opportunities International and has served in a variety of staff and command assignments during both peacetime and war. He served as the initial director of security cooperation for the U.S. Army in Africa, previously served as Army attaché in Nigeria, and many other countries across Africa, including Burundi, at the height of its civil war. During the Gulf War, Colonel Aubrey advised Saudi troops and commanded special forces in combat. He has been awarded the Bronze Star for Valor. And thank you for your service, distinguished service. We'll then hear from Mr. Stephen Rickard, who directs the Open Society's Washington office advocates working on both U.S. domestic and international issues. He has had a distinguished Washington career on Capitol Hill in the State Department and with human rights organizations. Before joining Open Society, he created and managed the Freedom Investment Project, working to encourage U.S. support for international justice. Mr. Rickard served as director of the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Center for Human Rights and as Washington director of Amnesty International USA. And he, too, was no stranger to this committee, and when he was in that position in particular, often came in and came up on the Hill and advised us and testified. Prior to that, he worked at the U.S. Department of State as well as in the U.S. Senate. We'll then hear from Ms. Elisa Massimino, who has been the President and Chief Executive Officer of Human Rights First since 2008. She helped establish the Washington office in 1991 and served as the organization's Washington Director from 1997 to 2008. She has a distinguished record of human rights advocacy in Washington. As a national authority on human rights law and policy, she has testified before Congress dozens of times, and I think at least a dozen before my subcommittee, including this subcommittee, and writes frequently for mainstream publications and specialized journals. The Washington newspaper, The Hill, has repeatedly named her as one of the most effective public advocates in the country. And finally, we'll hear from Sarah Morgan, who is the Washington Director of Human Rights Watch. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she was Associate Director of Sustainable Security and Peace Building at the Center for American Progress, where she researched and wrote a wide range of issues, including human rights, foreign aid, good governance, and global conflicts and crises. She also served in the U.S. Senate as Staff Director of the Senate Committee on Africa Affairs, became a Senior Policy Advisor for Oxfam America, and worked at the Open Society Institute. I'd like to, Ms. Blanchard, if you would begin.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting CRS to testify today. In my brief statement this afternoon, I will focus on the laws that require human rights vetting and their application in Nigeria. I would ask that my written testimony be submitted for the
Without objection, so ordered.
The State Department vets foreign security force units prior to providing U.S. assistance based on policy concerns and to comply with two legal provisions named for their original sponsor, Senator Patrick Leahy. They are just two of the many laws that Congress has enacted to promote human rights and to protect the U.S. image abroad by distancing the United States from abusive governments and security forces. The first provision is codified in the Foreign Assistance Act and applies to foreign aid programs and those authorized under the Arms Export Control Act. It prohibits assistance to foreign security force units credibly implicated in gross human rights abuses. The second provision, which applies to security assistance funded through DoD, has appeared in annual Defense Appropriations Act since 1998. Both provisions have been modified over time, as have the procedures for human rights vetting. The State Department and DoD Leahy provisions are similar, but not identical, and in recent years, legislation has brought the two provisions closer together. The foreign aid provisions apply to all forms of assistance. The DoD provision initially applied only to training, but was expanded in the past year to include equipment and other assistance. Some differences remain, notably in the standards for the remediation of units deemed ineligible for assistance and in the exceptions and existence of a waiver authority in the DoD provision. The FAA provision allows no exception from the law except through the credible remediation of the tainted unit, although aid could be provided through measures framed in law with notwithstanding provisions. The DoD Leahy provision, on the other hand, includes exceptions for equipment and other assistance, quote, necessary to assist in disaster relief operations or other humanitarian or national emergencies. The DoD provision also allows the Secretary of Defense to waive the provision in extraordinary circumstances. To date, however, the DoD has never issued a waiver, suggesting a very high bar for use. Despite the differences in the two laws, in practice, DoD and the State Department generally implement the Leahy laws similarly. Leahy vetting is a multi-stage process that begins at U.S. embassies abroad and concludes at State Department headquarters. During the process, the names of potential candidates for U.S. assistance are checked against a variety of sources for derogatory information. In the past 2 years, the process has resulted in an approval rate for more than 90% of candidates and in an outright denial for fewer than 1%. Growing DoD emphasis on partnering with foreign militaries to address threats such as terrorism has brought increased attention to the Leahy laws. Some military commanders have implied in some cases that the laws have complicated their ability to build foreign counterterrorism and counter-narcotics capabilities. Others suggest that U.S. training could improve the behavior of abusive forces by imparting U.S. values and respect for human rights and the rule of law. Attention to Leahy laws may intensify as DoD and the State Department determine what effect the new broader DoD Leahy provision will have on security assistance overseas. The expanded provision is repeated in the House version of the FY15 Defense Appropriations Act, and the Senate Armed Services Committee has proposed to codify the provision this year. As recent hearings have highlighted, the United States is currently seeking to balance security and human rights concerns in Nigeria. U.S. security assistance to Nigeria has been constrained by both law and policy concerns, and the security relationship has been hampered at times by a lack of cooperation from Nigerian officials and by systemic problems in the Nigerian military. Nigerian security force abuses in the context of operations to counter Boko Haram have complicated efforts to pursue greater cooperation, despite shared concerns about the group. Political and human rights concerns have been a prominent factor in shaping U.S.-Nigeria relations for decades. State Department reports have continued to highlight serious human rights violations by the Nigerian security forces for every year since the transition from military rule in 1999. According to the State Department, the information on security force abuses currently implicates roughly half the units in the Nigerian military and likely would render those units ineligible for assistance if they were submitted for vetting. Despite restrictions on some units, U.S. security assistance to Nigeria is sizable by regional standards, totaling almost $20 million in FY 2012 State Department funding and $16 million in FY 2013. DoD funding for Nigeria has been limited, but appears set to expand under a proposed new Global Security Contingency Fund program. Multiple systemic factors constrain the effectiveness of the Nigerian security force response to Boko Haram, notably security sector corruption and mismanagement. Some of these factors impede U.S. support even for units cleared for assistance. Many soldiers, particularly those in the Northeast, reportedly suffer from low morale, and they've struggled to keep pace with a foe that is increasingly well-armed and well-trained. By many accounts, Nigerian troops are not adequately resourced or equipped to counter the insurgency, despite a security budget approaching $6 billion. In the assessment of DoD officials, Nigerian funding for the military is skimmed off the top. DoD officials have assessed the Nigerian forces as, quote, slow to adapt to new strategies, new doctrines, and new tactics, and have described Nigeria as, quote, an extremely challenging partner to work with. U.S. officials have sought to encourage the government to take a more comprehensive counterterrorism approach, and one that is, in the words of one DoD official to Congress, less brutal. One of the primary aims of DoD engagement is to, quote, convince the Nigerians to change their tactics, techniques, and procedures in the Northeast. The State Department suggests that the Leahy Law has provided a strategic tool to encourage reforms in Nigeria and in Africa more broadly. The Nigerian military has sought to develop its own civilian protection and human rights monitoring and training in the past year, and the Nigerian president recently ordered more human rights training for officers. Nigerian officials have also made statements suggesting an evolving counterterrorism strategy, one that seeks not only security but also political and economic solutions. In sum, Nigeria provides an example of the challenges U.S. policymakers face in building foreign counterterrorism capacities. By many accounts, developing countries like Nigeria that are struggling with terrorist threats may desperately need the specialized skills and support that U.S. security assistance is designed to provide. But when security forces abuse civilians, U.S. engagement may risk not only tainting the U.S. image, but also may fuel popular grievances and alienate local populations. U.S. officials continue to explore ways to improve the vetting process and the dialogue with partner governments to enhance effectiveness and accountability and to mitigate the risk that U.S. partners might not use U.S. assistance responsibly. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I'd like to now ask Colonel Aubrey if he would present his comments to the committee.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today. As requested, I will focus my remarks today on what is commonly called the Leahy laws, which prohibit the provision of U.S. security assistance to foreign security force units that have been credibly implicated in violations of human rights. I previously submitted written comments to the committee and request that they be entered into your record.
Without objection, so ordered. And that of all of our distinguished witnesses will be made a part of the record, your statements and any material you'd like attached to it.
Thank you. Rather than reading what I had previously submitted, I would like to give some observations on security assistance that I've encountered in a 30-plus year career that focused on foreign internal defense, security assistance, and security cooperation as they affect training in Nigeria. Nigeria is a particularly difficult case. During my tour there from 2006 to 2008, I served with 3 different chiefs of Army staff. 2 were American trained, and I enjoyed good access and a large degree of cooperation. The 3rd was not U.S. trained, was uncooperative, and routinely refused to facilitate vetting for U.S. training, claiming it was an unreasonable infringement of Nigerian sovereignty. My team and I got the job done. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't prompt, and it definitely wasn't easy. Vetting could be near impossible. The standards are not beyond reasonable doubt, but credible. A misspelled name can result in unintentional blacklisting, and the system does not lend itself to correction. And more importantly, you have to have the host nation cooperating. If they do not cooperate, the system fails. There is no simple answer on how to solve vetting, training, and access in Nigeria. Corruption, poor leadership, regional differences, tribal issues, and religious conflicts plague Nigeria and its armed forces. Previous sanctions have led to a generation of leadership not enamored with the United States, having been trained, mentored, and cultivated by some of our global competitors. Nigeria does not have a command and control infrastructure that will allow its commanders in the field to have direct controls of his forces, relying on cell phones and, in some cases, runners to pass messages. Training is inadequate. Soldiers receive an inadequate amount of ammunition to train with. Officers frequently abuse their authorities, and there is no real professional NCO corps. The units that we have focused our attention on, usually those earmarked for external UN-sponsored peacekeeping missions, perform at a much higher standard but still suffer from the problems I described. At the same time, the Nigerians are fiercely proud of their accomplishment. They have West Africa's War College. They offer officer training to their neighbors. They have successfully deployed to neighboring countries, and they participate in regional exercises and deployments. All these issues help set the stage for the dilemma that is Nigeria and the difficulties faced in providing training to help combat the surge of Islamic extremism in the Northeast and their inability to contain the violence. Nigeria's problems in vetting can be found almost everywhere. In Liberia, the Liberian Armed Forces, a force recruited, vetted, trained, and still mentored by U.S. personnel, still have training delayed by vetting requirements, and we know that their force has not been accused of human rights violations. The rest of Africa has similar stories. In my written testimony, I passed a story relayed to me by one of my former subordinates that in Uganda, a misfire occurred in the attempt to rehabilitate a blacklisted unit. The end result was a blacklisting of the officer involved in the rehabilitation attempt rather than the rehabilitation of the blacklisted unit. I offer these following recommendations to the committee for consideration. Authorize DoD human rights training on a broad category of subjects similar to the expanded IMET program that we executed in the 1990s. Allow engagement that is designed to professionalize those errant forces, teach the law of land for human rights, the military role in civil societies, and other such subjects. Develop an exit strategy for the bad units and individuals that will build for the potential for full engagement. Rehabilitate and professionalize rather than punish. And finally, develop some type of vetting process for units like the LAF. If we don't engage, our global competitors can and usually will. I want to thank this committee for this opportunity, and I stand ready to answer your questions.
Colonel Aubrey, thank you very much for your testimony, and coming from someone who actually, in the embassy, provided this kind of training and vetting, it's very important that we receive your insights. We'd like to hear. We'd like to hear from Mr. Rickard, if you could provide your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for holding the hearing, and thank you, Ranking Member Bass and the other distinguished members of the committee for your commitment to human rights and to Africa as demonstrated by your service on this important subcommittee. And I'd be very happy to talk about some of the LGBT issues that the Ranking Member raised, which are extremely important. I have worked on the Leahy Law in one form or another for nearly 17 years. I've discussed them with countless State Department and defense officials as well as human rights experts all over the globe. You know, the Leahy laws are just common sense. They prohibit the United States government from arming or providing military training to security force or police units abroad that have been credibly alleged to commit a small list of the very worst human rights violations. These laws do not prohibit the United States from providing assistance even in the most violent, conflict-racked countries like Nigeria and Colombia. On the contrary, because the Leahy Law involves a unit-by-unit examination of human rights records, the Leahy laws provide a formula for the United States to engage in countries like Nigeria. They are a formula for success in those countries, not a prohibition on engagement. Indeed, Colonel Aubrey's description of the success story in Liberia in his written testimony seems to me a perfect example of what can be accomplished when we build human rights vetting and training into our system from the ground up. If it can work in Liberia and it can work in Colombia, it can work in Nigeria and elsewhere. I'd like the members of the committee to keep in mind 4 numbers when you think about the Leahy Law. The first is 530,000. That's the number of units that the United States government now considers training, or had considered training in just the last 3 years, 530,000. The second number is 90%. That's the number of those units that got a quick response, a green light to proceed after they were vetted, generally within 10 days. There's even a fast-track procedure for countries that have generally good human rights records. The third number, which you referred to, Mr. Chairman, is 1%. Less than 1% of the time, a unit is prohibited from receiving assistance under the Leahy Law. It is not a burdensome requirement. But the final number is 2,516. The Leahy Law blocks aid in a tiny percentage of cases, but that doesn't mean it's unimportant. And 2,516 is the number of vetted units that the U.S. government found to be credibly involved in gross atrocities in just the last 3 years. In other words, without the Leahy laws, this hearing wouldn't be about a handful of units that DOD would like to work with but can't because of their atrocious human rights records. This would be a hearing about the 2,516 units that we did assist, that we gave guns to, that we gave military assistance to, and only later discovered that members of those units had committed murder, rape, and torture. The Leahy Law stopped that, and it stopped it 2,516 times in just the last 3 years. Those 2,516 units weren't being asked to meet a high standard. The Leahy Law doesn't require pristine forces. The State Department defines gross human rights violations to cover 5 gross crimes: murder, torture, rape, disappearances, and other gross violations of life and liberty. That's it. So when the Leahy Law doesn't even prohibit you from working with those units if the government will clean them up. So when someone tells you that we can't work with a unit, I'd encourage you to ask 3 questions. The first is, what did the unit do that got it on the list? If we can't work with them, it must mean that the United States has determined that that unit is one of the worst of the worst. It's in the 1% of units that the U.S. found credible information that they were committing murder, rape, torture, disappearances, or other gross crimes. Second question, why won't the government clean them up? The Leahy Law lets you work with a unit if the government will take effective action. Maybe the government, as Colonel Aubrey has said, doesn't accept the U.S. commitment or considers it an infringement on its sovereignty. Maybe it doesn't want to let the U.S. tell it what to do. Maybe the government has no control over the units, and it can't clean up the units even if it wants to. But ask yourself, why won't the government or can't the government clean up these units? And finally ask, if we know or believe that these units have committed the worst of the worst offenses, if the government will not or cannot clean up the units, Why should the U.S. taxpayers pay to give those units, those specific units rather than other units, guns and military training? There are a number of things that could be done to improve the Leahy Law, and I think there's a lot of common ground here. We should increase funding for vetting. And I would note that since Colonel Aubrey's examples in Nigeria, there has already been a revolution in Leahy Law vetting. An excellent database has been created. There are now 13 professional vetters who do this work. There is, in fact, a system to correct mistakes in the document. So there has been enormous progress in the last few years. Two, we should make remediation and vetting a cost of doing business. We should set aside 1 penny out of every dollar to just say, this goes to vetting and fixing the bad units. If we want to be in Nigeria, that's just a cost of doing business there. Three, we should train people. Many of the examples that Colonel Aubrey cites are examples of misunderstandings of the law. And if people had simply understood the law better, including the case that he cites in Uganda, that problem would have never arisen. So more training would be better. In my written testimony, I respond to many of the common criticisms of the law, and I'd be happy to do so in response to questions. But I would like to ask people to consider what the lower standard would be below the Leahy Law. Should we take rape off the list of gross human rights violations? Should we take murder off the list? Should we say that if you haven't murdered anybody in 2 years or 4 years, that's enough, now we'll give you guns? Should we have a statute of limitations? This is the rock bottom human rights requirements that we should have. Mr. Chairman, I'm a preacher's kid, and the Bible tells us that in the book of Acts, that before his conversion on the road to Damascus, the Apostle Paul was a persecutor of the Christian church. In fact, according to Acts, he was present at the killing of St. Stephen, my namesake. But the Bible tells us that he cast no stones himself at the killing of St. Stephen. What he did was he held the cloaks of the people who did. He cast no stones, but he was complicit. He gave support to the people who did. Now, when we go to places tonight like Nigeria, shouldn't we at least ask ourselves, whose cloaks are we holding? Who are we handing stones to? That's what the Leahy Law asks. That's all that it asks. Let's not be complicit in the worst human rights abuses in places like Nigeria. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rickard, thank you very much for your testimony. We will take a short recess. There are a number of votes occurring on the floor. We have about a minute to get over and vote. So we stand in recess. Thank you. The subcommittee will continue its hearing, and Mr. Pittenger does have to go, but he would like to ask a question of the panelists, and then we'll go to Ms. Massimino.
Thank you. Really appreciate the good work that you all do, and certainly hope that our advocacy can make a difference for the lives of these wonderful people. A motto I've lived by is inspect what you expect. So I'd like to ask you, as we take a little bit more depth in the effectiveness of the embassies, the DOD, the State Department, and how they're doing in the vetting process. A fundamental piece of this discussion is knowing whether we are accurately identifying the good actors or if we are misidentifying bad actors as good ones. Ms. Blanchard, can we start with you?
That's a tough question. You know, the embassies in many of these countries have to rely greatly on groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International for the reporting. I mean, these embassies are only staffed, particularly in Africa, they're small staffs. So they're relying on that reporting, and then they have to determine whether that reporting is credible or not. They also, benefit from local journalists and local NGOs, and they have the very difficult task, particularly in countries like Nigeria that are strategically important, that face serious threats, in determining whether that information is valid on a security force unit or not. So I think that there's a lot of challenge there, and when you've got short-staffed embassies, it's
Sure.
yeah.
Makes a difference. Anybody else would like to respond to that?
I'd be happy to make a quick response. I think the short answer is it depends. It varies very much from embassy to embassy. In some cases, it's particularly dependent on the ambassador. At the embassy, we've seen a real overhaul in vetting in certain embassies. I think the Colombian embassy, U.S. Embassy in Colombia, has done a very good job of putting human rights vetting to the forefront of its relationship with the security forces there. Doesn't mean the relationship is perfect. It doesn't mean the security forces themselves are perfect. In fact, they're quite the opposite still. But it has become a central part of the conversation, and each side knows what is expected. The other piece that I would just add very briefly is that this is an important question because it's essential that the executive branch embrace the Leahy law and human rights vetting as part of its foreign policy, and so that they do a job both at the Foreign Service Institute in training officers, but also encourage the military to train officers to understand the law, what it means to apply it, what the expectations are, and how to clean, if you will, units that have been dirty.
Ms. Massimino?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question because there is another asset that we have or that we could exploit more fully in the Leahy vetting process, and that is in addition to internationally focused NGOs, the local NGOs could be they often have the best, most up-to-date, most reliable information, but a lot of times they don't understand how the process works, what level of detail they need, the form that the information needs to be in. So it would be worth our while, I think, a good investment in reaching out and having the embassies reach out to those local human rights defenders, explain to them what the Leahy law is, solicit their information, develop relationships with them. The State Department has issued these human rights defender principles, guidance on how embassies ought to interact with human rights activists in country, and it really is a kind of a blueprint for how to develop good relationships with those NGOs. And if those were fully implemented, I think we'd have an additional resource in making sure that the vetting is well done.
Thank you. Colonel?
The only thing I would add to the discussion is the need to do a whole-of-embassy approach on that. Make sure that the defense attaché is incorporated in there. Part of the problem is on the identification is making sure that the units are properly identified. That DAT is going to know that the unit that came out of Sokoto that had this type of unit patch, that had this type of equipment that committed, the violation was, a particular unit. In that way, even if the people reporting it don't understand the military order of battle, is that with a whole-of-embassy approach and you actually ask the accurate questions, it can actually be pinpointed properly.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have one more question, if that's okay. Thank you. Well, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the real impact of the Leahy laws that they've had. Do you feel the foreign countries have been impacted by our reluctance to aid security forces engaged in human rights violations? And if so, could you give possible examples of what actions that they've taken?
In terms of effectiveness of the Leahy Law, I think some of it depends on how much the country wants our assistance. And I think this may be a question in the case of Nigeria. In cases that want U.S. assistance, and there are a few on the continent that I think of as an example, countries like Colombia, if they want U.S. assistance, then they will generally comply with our rules and regulations. And often you will see even senior military people switched out and units, go through this process of remediation. And the clearer that the embassy staff can be with the host country on how that remediation process works, the more likely we are to see accountability. If a country doesn't want our assistance, then how effective can the vetting be? That's
Sure. Thank you very much for your dedication and your good work. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for the courtesy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pinch.
Asking.
I appreciate it. Ms. Massimino, if you could proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to share our views on human rights vetting and the critical role that it plays in advancing human rights and U.S. national security. I want to also express my profound gratitude to you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on this and so many important human rights issues. You came to Congress about the same time that Human Rights First was born, and I feel like we've been working together ever since. There's really nobody in Congress and very few people outside of Congress who can match your passion and persistence. You are a constant reminder to your colleagues and to all of us that respect for human rights is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And Human Rights First is actually an organization that's built on that idea. Our central mission is to foster American leadership on human rights, and human rights vetting requirements, the Leahy laws, are absolutely critical to that leadership. When Secretary Kerry rolled out the Human Rights Country Reports this year, he said, "The places where we face some of the greatest national security challenges today are also places where governments deny basic human rights to their nation's peoples, and that is no coincidence." As the U.S. expands its partnerships with foreign military and security forces to counter new threats, it's important to keep that in mind. Respect for human rights is neither a trump that beats other national interests, nor is it a soft concern that can be traded off or deferred without undermining those very interests. Respect for human rights, rather, is a cornerstone. It's a foundation on which to advance other national priorities. While the United States serves its national interests when it lives up to its ideals, the converse is also true. We've learned from years of experience that it's not just our reputation that's degraded when our partners engage in abusive and predatory practices, it's our security as well. Association with these abuses weakens U.S. moral authority, an increasingly, I think, undervalued resource these days, and alienates the civilian populations whose support is essential in the struggle against terrorism. And it's used by terrorists to validate grievances and to recruit others to their cause. The Leahy laws are sometimes viewed as an insurance policy to minimize the risk that American leaders are seen as collaborators with criminals. And that's an important thing. But human rights vetting is much more than human rights risk insurance. I'd like to focus on two other strategic objectives of the Leahy laws that underscore both its importance and its practicality. First is the Leahy law's role in promoting accountability. In any country, real accountability in security services depends on the capacity and the willingness of civilian institutions to act. The Leahy laws encourage respect for human rights by providing an incentive for foreign governments to bring violators in their security forces to justice. The Leahy laws by themselves can't ensure that our security partners will hold abusive individuals and units accountable. For the law to be effective, the U.S. must embed it in a broader human rights strategy. Proper training helps foster a culture of accountability, which is one of the reasons that professionalizing partner forces is a key component of our national defense strategy. Properly trained security forces understand the negative ramifications of human rights abuses and thus are less likely to commit them. So the vetting process required by the Leahy laws not only encourages the development of justice mechanisms, but when it's paired with robust training and assistance programs, it fosters professionalism with security forces that ultimately makes resort to those mechanisms less necessary. The other strategic value of the Leahy laws is their contribution to the conduct of U.S. counterterrorism operations. By encouraging foreign governments to institute counterterrorism policies premised on the rule of law and respect for human rights, and by demanding accountability for human rights violations, the U.S. creates the legitimacy needed for effective counterterrorism operations and mitigates the conditions that help give rise to extremism. Consider Colombia. The U.S. Embassy in Bogota has fully embraced the Leahy laws with 2 full-time staff positions dedicated to vetting 30 to 35,000 individuals annually. None of that was easy, it wasn't cheap, and Leahy vetting is not a panacea. But after a decade of effort and targeted aid that has spurred improvements, the Colombian government continues to take action against many violators of human rights. Finally, the Leahy law is just not an obstacle to pursuing our security goals. I know there are some, including the military and some here in the Congress, who've expressed concerns that the Leahy laws create an obstacle to our security goals because they bar the U.S. from equipping security forces on the front lines of conflicts such as in Nigeria. The logic behind this position is that in some conflicts there just are no good options, and that in service of a larger objective against a bigger threat, the U.S. may need to tolerate units that have committed abuses. But those concerns should be assuaged just by the facts. It's really important not to conflate the need to work with governments and militaries that have questionable human rights records with what the Leahy law is intended to prevent. For our part at Human Rights First, we believe that when the U.S. military interacts with foreign militaries, it's generally a net plus in terms of effectiveness, professionalism, and governance by the rule of law. But no matter what lens you view it through, it is never in America's interest to arm or train or partner with individuals or units that are credibly believed to have committed torture, rape, or other such heinous crimes. Now, I've heard and I understand from the State Department and others that the Leahy laws have never really prevented the U.S. from engaging in an essential operation. There has always been a more reliable, rights-respecting alternative. As you heard from our colleague, Ms. Blanchard, the numbers really speak for themselves. If there's a problem getting training and assistance to the right people in Nigeria, I'm not sure it's because of the Leahy laws. Clearly, we don't want the Leahy laws to end up disqualifying good people who share our goals and seek our support from getting it. Those individuals are not covered under Leahy, and in fact, it's not uncommon for a new unit to be created for the sole purpose of excluding abusers and making sure we can help those people who share our values and our goals. And not only should we be cooperating with those military forces who share our goals, we also should be working with them to help them demand accountability for those accused of crimes. I suspect that the belief in some quarters that human rights vetting is a hindrance rather than a help in the country's battle against terrorism and other security threats might grow out of a failure to recognize its value. We all know that in the face of danger, the big picture tends to get lost, and human rights vetting comes to seem a little bit like do-goodism that can be disregarded in the interest of national security. But we should reject the temptation to cut moral and legal corners. The Leahy laws really derive from the bipartisan commitment to our country's ideals, and those ideals are a national security asset. And when we ally ourselves with those who undermine human rights, we're endangering ourselves. Now, we have in the written statement several recommendations for improving implementation of the human rights vetting process, and maybe we can address those in the questions and answers. But I thank you for your leadership again in holding this hearing and for digging in, as usual, on the details of what can make human rights real.
Ms. Massimino, thank you very much for your testimony, for your leadership for decades. We will get to your recommendations, but as soon as we hear from our next Ms. Morgan.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm really pleased this subcommittee is looking at the details of human rights vetting and its application in Nigeria and beyond. It's a timely hearing given the impending U.S. redeployment from Afghanistan and the inevitable shift in resources and priorities that will occur. In fact, this shift has already begun with President Obama's recent creation of the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund and other correlated efforts to strengthen the capabilities of foreign military partners. It's a renewed and expanded approach to security assistance that calls for a reinvigorated attention to the Leahy Law as a critical tool to finding the right balance between incentivizing institutional reform and addressing ongoing and systemic abuses that undermine larger U.S. security goals. As you've noted, Mr. Chairman, the Leahy Law is an important means to ensure that the U.S. is not complicit in grave human rights abuses abroad and that it upholds its international legal obligations. But it also makes sense within the larger foreign policy context, since militaries that commit abuses can also exacerbate longstanding grievances, escalate atrocities, foment political instability, and provide abusive armed opposition groups and terrorist organizations with a very powerful recruiting tool. As examples, I'd like to talk a little bit about our research in Nigeria and then move off the continent for a second to talk about Iraq, given that it's returned to the media pretty heavily. Since long before the Chibok abductions and the Bring Back Our Girl campaign captured the world's attention, Human Rights Watch has been reporting on the crisis in northern Nigeria and the serious abuses the security forces have perpetrated in responding to it. In 2009, we denounced the government's killing while in custody of Boko Haram leader Mohammed Yusuf and many others, acts which are widely believed to have spurned further violence by the group. In October 2012, we released a report that looked not only at Boko Haram's atrocities, but also at the impact of Nigeria's heavy-handed security response. We found that in an attempt to halt increasing violent attacks between 2010 and 2012, Nigeria's security forces killed hundreds of Boko Haram suspects, along with members of local communities who were apparently attacked at random. Our research made clear that the members of the security forces used excessive force, were physically abusive, detained suspects, secretly stole money, and burned homes. In May 2013, Human Rights Watch issued another report examining massive destruction in the northern town of Baga. We used satellite imagery and witness evidence to confirm that while Boko Haram did attack a military patrol, kill a soldier, and wound 5 others, the government's response was directed at the local community, as government forces burned homes and killed local residents. Our satellite images actually indicated high levels of building destruction, but because we were not able to visit the north, we weren't able to confirm death figures from witnesses of almost 200 people. Security force abuse in Nigeria is not limited to the Boko Haram crisis, as I'm sure you know. It's deeply systemic. Over the years, we've documented many cases of abuse and apparent indiscriminate or excessive use of force outside of insurgency-related situations, from the oil-producing Niger Delta region to arbitrary killings in response to intercommunal violence in Nigeria's Middle Belt, to political violence that often accompanies elections at all levels of government, to even smaller events, such as one that occurred about a week and a half ago in the city of Lagos, where it appears soldiers went on a bus-burning rampage, randomly beating and harassing city residents after a bus ran over and killed one of their fellow fighters earlier that morning. This abusive conduct completely undermines the security forces' effectiveness and creates strong resentment within the communities they are ostensibly there to protect. In the case of Boko Haram, many Nigerians have expressed reluctance to share any information that might help stop the group because they're afraid it will be used against them. Worse still, the Nigerian government has largely failed to undertake any kind of credible investigation in the ongoing and pervasive security force abuses that have repeatedly been brought to their attention. More than 10 years on, the government has still not held any members of the security forces accountable for a 2001 massacre of more than 200 people in Bentiu State. If we turn to Iraq very briefly, as another example where Prime Minister al-Maliki's heavy-handed approach to security has exacerbated security tensions, perpetuated impunity, and undermined the rule of law, we see that in January 2013, the Prime Minister promised to reform the criminal justice system, but a year later had done nothing, and the brutal tactics of his security forces remain essentially the same. In late May, just before the initial advance of ISIS, Human Rights Watch documented how Iraqi security forces were dropping barrel bombs on populated areas and attacking hospitals in Fallujah as the government intensified its campaign against a broadly defined group of insurgents. This is not to say that Iraq hasn't been grappling with some very serious security threats. We know this. But the government's excessive use of force in law enforcement situations and violations of the laws of war has hindered rather than helped the country's counterterrorism efforts. He's terrified hundreds of civilians, killed thousands more, and the government has alienated affected populations, many of which could have been potential allies in the name of, quote unquote, combating terrorism. A cautious approach to security assistance combined with robust Leahy vetting is essential given the body of objective evidence in both cases implicating security forces in gross human rights abuses. The Washington Post editorial board noted earlier this week, if U.S.-backed forces commit human rights abuses, the damage is twofold. The fight against insurgents is compromised, and so is support for the alliance with the United States. We also have a number of recommendations, which I will shorten, but very briefly. The first is that Human Rights Watch would recommend support for the larger $5 million in the Senate appropriation for the Leahy vetting to ensure that embassies have the right staff. The second is for the administration and Congress to press the administration to move much more quickly on developing guidance for remediation and accountability. And finally, just to pick up on this last point that you mentioned earlier, the administration needs to do a much better job of publicly embracing the principles of the Leahy Law at extremely senior levels and making clear both the implication and the consequences for all partner nations. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony and for your specific recommendations, which will be very helpful to the subcommittee. All of your comments and testimony, I think, will be of tremendous nature. We're in an inflection point. We're at a crossroads, I think, especially with the president's proposal and language that you, Ms. Blanchard, pointed out in a June 26th submission to Congress with regards that would seemingly bypass the Leahy Amendment, the notwithstanding language, any limitation in a provision of law that would otherwise restrict the amount of or recipients of such support or assistance contingent on notification to Congress that it is in the national security interest to do so. As part of the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund, and I thank you for amplifying that in your testimony. So this does come, I think, at an important point in this debate. I would like to ask one general question about Nigeria, and Colonel Aubrey, you might want to be first to answer it. We tried as a committee for approximately 2 years to get the administration to designate Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization. Matter of fact, Greg Simpkins and I traveled to Jos and to Abuja last September, and the primary reason for going was to try to figure out why that FTO was not forthcoming, which, again, just like Leahy's not a panacea, nor is FTO. There's no panaceas, but they're all tools in the toolbox that could help choke and stop the flow of funds, or at least figure out where those funds are coming from. And sooner is always better than later, rather than waiting to a stage 4 cancer, which Boko Haram has become. And so my question is, when we get to training, properly vetted, Mr. Rickard talked about 530,000 as a number, and you have a number of different time period, Ms. Blanchard, in your testimony. But large numbers of troops, service members have been trained pursuant to Leahy. Only a small percentage are excluded. It does take some time, of course. But the question would be about the small number, the infinitesimal small number of Nigerians who indeed have been trained, especially since Mr. Jackson had testified on the Senate side that roughly half of the Nigerian forces would be eligible for military training, and that is especially important in counterinsurgency training. So your thoughts on 1,200, 1,300, I don't know what the number is for fiscal year 2013, but it's not much when one battalion is trained, and the need for 5 to 10 with that very special skill set, human rights oriented. Your thoughts on that? It seems like it's too small.
I'm not sure that numbers itself really is relevant on that. I've always felt that the Nigerian Army had sufficient strength to protect its borders. What you're talking about is national will, Chairman, is do they have the wherewithal and do they have the trust of their military to effectively train and arm and deploy? And I say that, very cognizant about their military history. while I was president in Nigeria, we were very confident that the amount of ammunition that they would issue out their soldiers was usually zero. That we had people going through training in Jaji, the infantry training center, preparing to deploy to Darfur, that had been in their unit for 5 years and had never fired their weapon once. It's incumbent on the National Command Authority to trust its elements of defense and security. Unfortunately, the history in Nigeria does not lend the civil administration great confidence of that. And that's why I said, well, my current military peers that had served in the 90s probably will curse me for my statement about expanded IMET. I know that when I had to implement that, I was not happy about having to do some of the defense sector reform initiatives prior to doing regular military training, because that is what the targeted nation wanted. But there is something to be said about teaching a military's proper role in civil society, both on the civilian side, where the civilians understand how to properly command and control the military, but having the military understand the divisions. In Nigeria, the incidences that have been talked about, that's their own people that they're going into. It's not an enemy. It's not enemy combatants on a foreign shore. So understanding that civil-military relationship, taking some of the lessons learned that we've learned from 13 years of combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, and how atrocities make the jobs more difficult. It makes achievement of the mission goals much more harder. I don't have a solution. I'm just an observation that the problems in Nigeria is trust.
Yes.
I think Colonel Aubrey has touched on a number of the issues. I think there is certainly an issue of political will and also a follow-through on the part of the Nigerians. If you look at sort of the two areas of security cooperation where we've had the most success, it's been in peacekeeping training and in maritime security and counter-narcotics. The Nigerians have recently been making the decision to scale back their contributions to peacekeeping, and they are dropping further down the list, and they were always one of the top 5 contributors. They are no longer. So they are making some different decisions about how they allocate their military resources. In terms of special forces capabilities, they haven't prioritized that. We started, I believe, in 2010 to try to work with a special counterterrorism unit. They didn't keep the unit together. We're facing that challenge now where they are still debating whether a unit that's been cleared and trained to do counterterrorism missions will actually have that mission. So there's been some challenges, I think, in follow-through, particularly in engagement with us on things that we've offered and things that they've taken us up on. So I'll leave that.
Yes.
Just wanted to pick up on those points. I think you raised the right question, and in the grand scheme, the small number of units that have been trained are not enough. But it's important to remember a couple of things. First is, in the specific case of Boko Haram, a military solution is not going to fix the problem. And so while it may be that more clean units need to be engaged, it is not solely a military problem. It needs to be engaged in a much wider and more comprehensive approach, which requires much greater political will from the government in Abuja. That's the first point. The second point—
On that point, if I could—
Sure.
Is it possible that Boko Haram has gotten to the point where, I mean, we're looking at ISIS every day and seeing the gains they are making in Iraq, which seems to have caught many people flat-footed, both in Baghdad as well as in Washington and other capitals. I mean, they have built up a critical mass, the likes of which, I mean, they weren't supposed to be able to project power on Abuja, and a month before we got there, they blew up a bus station. It's almost as if they're extending with impunity their ability to kill and maim, and of course the Chibok schoolgirl's abduction, followed by other abductions and slaughter of young men as well, and boys in school. It's as if the terror reign has gone to an unprecedented level, and they've gotten stronger, not weaker. So just a thought, but your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. I think we've reached a much more violent and expanded version of Boko Haram right now. I do think in part that has to do with the heavy-handed approach from the Nigerian security forces and their response, not exclusively, but I do think over the short term what the Nigerians need to be looking at is putting together units and putting political will behind that to deal with the immediate military and protection concerns. But then there also needs to be a much larger response that looks at the historic marginalization and disenfranchisement and poverty of the North that has enabled Boko Haram to capitalize on and move forward with that type of strategy.
Yes, Ms. Massimino.
I would just reinforce what Colonel Aubrey said, because I thought really you crystallized the problem that is often faced with human rights vetting and with so many other situations where we're faced with kind of a short-term, long-term, what appears to be a conflict. And I really welcomed your comment that, this doesn't feel as urgent, perhaps, to establish these mechanisms for accountability, build up, foreign militaries' JAG corps, educate them about the proper relationships with their civilian masters and all of that. But if we don't do that, everything else is harder. And so holding to the discipline of that is really important, and I think that's exactly what we're facing with implementation of the Leahy laws.
Ms. Morgan, you mentioned in your testimony in your recommendation section, if I could just find it briefly, that Congress should press the administration to develop clear policy guidance on how the diplomats and military officials can support foreign governments to promote accountability. And you also point out, finally, the administration should publicly embrace the principles of the Leahy law, especially with regards to Nigeria. Has that happened at the highest levels of our government?
I would say that in the aftermath of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, there has been a very clear understanding at senior levels from this government, from this administration, about the need to be cautious in engaging with the Nigerian military. The administration is well aware of the problems. Has it been embraced prior to that? Not in the way that it should have been. It doesn't mean that any laws are being violated, of course not. But it does mean that engagement at the ambassador level and at the embassy needs to be much more robust. When U.S. government officials, particularly military officials, are going to Nigeria, human rights vetting and security cooperation needs to be a top talking point, which to the best of my knowledge, it has not been until very recently.
Has it been enough of a priority, and Colonel, you might want to speak to this as well, within the administration to say Boko Haram is a lethal, growing cancer on the body politic of Nigeria, just like al-Shabaab, did such unbelievable damage, still does, in Somalia, and now is projecting that damage to Nigeria, to Kenya and elsewhere. My feeling is, and you don't have to share it, is that there's been an underappreciation of the threat, which means we could have been accelerating the number. If half of the Nigerian military is eligible to be trained, by implication that half are not, pursuant to Leahy, why weren't we training more? And why isn't there not a hurry-up offense to get as many well-vetted but specially trained troops to protect the Nigerian people, the largest country in sub-Saharan Africa?
If I could speak to that.
Please do.
The administration, I think, has taken very seriously the threat posed by Boko Haram for quite a long time. I think one of the challenges, and former Assistant Secretary Carson made it clear that one of the reasons that the deliberations on whether or not to designate Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization took a while was that there was concern raised by a number of NGOs and African studies academics here in the United States and elsewhere that actually labeling the group a foreign terrorist organization. Now, the State Department made several statements labeling them a terrorist organization, but the actual FTO designation, the concern was that that might be seen to give a green light to the security force abuses that they were seeing in the Northeast by the Joint Task Force. Those reports went back, obviously, to Sarah talked about back to 2009, but particularly as the Joint Task Force stood up from 2011 onward, we were seeing a lot of very, very serious reporting coming out, and there was the concern that the Nigerian government might perceive that designation to give a green light to those operations. And on the flip side, there was not clear evidence, from what I understand from talking to administration officials, that the implications of the FTO designation, i.e. the ability to freeze funds in the United States and stop travel of Boko Haram individuals in the United States, would have much of an effect. There wasn't evidence to suggest that there was a lot of
Well, I get your point, but there is a larger issue whether or not sufficient personnel are deployed at Treasury, for example. Even now that FTO has been designated to really make a difference and to work this 24/7 to try to find out where the AK-47s, the IEDs, and everything else is coming from. And I've asked those questions, and I have not gotten the kinds of answers that would make one sleep well at night. We're not working it, in my opinion, the way we could or should. That's even FTO, so I just throw that out. Anybody else want to, on the issue, oh, yes.
Mr. Chairman, the only thing I would add is that the extremist issue in the Trans-Sahel area is not a new one, and isn't a new one to the Department of State, to Congress, or to the Department of Defense. I go back to where I said on national will. Burkina Faso for years denied that there was issues in the north. And it was only after many years and many discussions that they actually acknowledge. The host nation has to request the assistance, and until they do, until they recognize the problem, it's hard to help a partner nation develop an effective strategy.
Let me just ask the question with regards to units versus individuals, and just get each of you, if you would, your thoughts on that. You make the point, Colonel, that, it's sometimes the taint is forever. And I was talking to Elisa Massimino before we reconvened, and it just struck me that there are a number of units in the U.S. military, including the unit that Lieutenant William Calley was a part of, the Abu Ghraib deployment, where the bad apples were prosecuted, not enough, obviously, with Lieutenant Calley. He was the only one who was convicted as a result of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. And it just seems to me that maybe reconstituting or encouraging host governments like, or friendly governments like Nigeria to come up with a brand new unit, as opposed to an old unit that has a terrible reputation. And as you point out, Ms. Blanchard, there's a tension there, and you do quote the Admiral William McRaven in congressional testimony that while he supported the vetting process, it has restricted us to the number of countries and our ability to train units that we think need to be trained. Individuals, that is an absolute, given that individuals should be vetted to the greatest extent possible. But it does become at least problematic about the unit side. Your thoughts on that? Because it seems to me that it's worth a discussion. And I'm sure there'll be a little difference of opinion at the panel.
And I'll bring myself back to what had been my profession for most of my adult life, is we're quite proud of those little pieces of cloth, the streamers that hang from our regimental colors and so forth. Asking someone to rebadge doesn't usually sit very well with a soldier. They're quite proud of their unit lineage. If you look at the battle streamers on the Army colors, they date back to Valley Forge. So approaching any other country's units to discuss, reconstitution doesn't necessarily sit well. Whether or not we agree with their lineage, a lot of times they're quite proud of their lineage. That on these units, they, because of their colonial past, they talk about the colonial wars they fought, or what they did in the First World War, the Second World War, and are quite proud, and rightfully so, of their lineage. I think what is even more important is that for the Leahy veterans, whether it's in the embassy or with Invest, is that they understand the order of battle and understand what the units really mean. What is the difference between a section or a platoon, a division, a battalion? Who ranks what, the sergeant or the general? And that would be effectively to understand what the unit rotation is. What is the term of enlistment to the unit? Liberia, which was had a term of enlistment. They just the first batch of they've just brought in their second batch of recruits since the LAF was reconstituted. So if you know that they're going to do a rotation in 6 years, that if a unit had done something 10 years ago, the chances of anybody being in that unit having committed that atrocity is gone. That would be much more effective than saying, take the 131 that committed atrocities in Maiduguri 3 years ago, and we're going to rebadge it as a 151 because we won't know.
Thank you. Ms. Masmino.
Yes. So the examples that you gave of the, of U.S. units where there were abuses, those are examples where there was investigation, prosecution, and, that's, I think, in order to get the full value of the Leahy laws and human rights vetting, as I said in my testimony, you don't want that viewed in sort of a narrow way where you just kind of rearrange the deck chairs and see if you can assemble. I mean, that's one way, and it's perfectly permissible under the law to create new units and all that. But really what we want, what we all want, fundamentally the Leahy law, is to prompt better human rights performance, stronger commitment on the part of the militaries and the governments to accountability and the rule of law. And you don't get that if you're, just rearranging the deck chairs. But, as to these units that, have this sense of identity and cohesion and all of that, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But we all know that there are units that are, proud and have cohesion around the wrong things. They are notorious for being human rights violators. And I think, there you really have to wonder whether long-term the interests are going to be served if you're balancing, those interests with keeping that band of brothers together when they, what has drawn them together and the identity of the unit is not something you want to perpetuate.
Yes, Ms.
Just quickly, I think if you're talking about rogue elements or abusive units within an otherwise law-abiding military in the country, then the unit should be disbanded and the individual should be prosecuted. This is, in fact, what we've recommended in specific cases in Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Afghanistan. But if it goes beyond the rogue elements or the abusive units and is a more endemic problem within the security forces, then nothing else is going to suffice, as Elisa said, as opposed to accountability or prosecution. And there the U.S. can play a really important role. The State Department, USAID, Defense Department, and Justice all have really deep and varied experience in helping set up justice mechanisms, technical expertise. Prosecution is a critical component that helps with the institutional reform. So it really depends on what you're looking at when it comes to the unit.
Let me ask, oh, yes, Ms. Blanchard.
Just a final point. Three things. I think one, creating new units demonstrates political will, and we've seen a number of important security partners on the continent that do that because there are issues with tainted units, and we've been able to move forward, particularly contributors to the mission in Somalia. The second point is that the vetting process should really ensure that they try to identify the smallest unit possible when they have evidence of an abuse. We've seen cases in important security partners, again in East Africa, where larger units have been tainted because the NGO reporting on the information wasn't able to get it down, and as a result, we've had training, important counterterrorism training postponed with very key battalions. And then the third point is the fact that there are differences in the laws, and perhaps there are differences in the laws for a reason. The State Department / FAA Leahy provision requires that these individuals be taken to justice. The language in the DOD law is slightly different, and as a result, you can have the individual taken out and not necessarily go through a court of law system to get the unit back to being eligible for training. So.
I have a lot of other questions, but let me just, I'll ask them all and ask if you, whichever ones you would want to respond to. First, starting with, I went on the website for the Nigerian Army last night, and one of the feature parts of that website talks about how the International Committee for the Red Cross is collaborating with the NA, the Nigerian Army, and it talks about a training the trainers program, law of armed conflict programs. Obviously, I think they're primarily focused on peacekeeping, but I guess they might be talking about other good human rights-oriented behavior. What is your thought on that kind of collaboration? Because obviously it's front and center, and hopefully, the ICRC is conveying some very important principles and best practices with regards to human rights. Secondly, some of you may know that I am the prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. When we did the reauthorization in 2003, we added a provision that militaries would be part of the minimum standards. And I still am concerned that when we look at a country's performance vis-a-vis the minimum standards prescribed in the law, that militaries are not sufficiently taken into consideration as to the tier ranking, tier 1, tier 2, 3, or watch list. And I'm wondering, with regards to Leahy, how focused are we on trafficking with regards to a military? Is that being, I have tried unsuccessfully for well over a decade to establish an assistant secretary within DOD's chain of command that would be focused in an office exclusively on trafficking. Because I'm a great believer, because I talk to generals and armed forces leaders throughout the world every time I travel, it seems. I always bring up trafficking, and when a politician or a lawmaker brings it up, it certainly does not have the gravitas that it would have if a colonel or somebody with a few stars was talking military to military, training the trainers, so to speak, language. I know that DOD does a wonderful job in many cases, but I'm wondering if in the vetting process, trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, is included. And we know one of the things that Chakao said was that he was going to sell the women from the Chibok school and the young girls. No one knows if that has happened, but obviously trafficking is everywhere, and it's a horrific crime. Thirdly would be if somebody is unfairly excluded. Say a commander has, a platoon or a squad or a number of people that really are up-and-comers, they really are wonderful soldiers, and somehow they get excluded in the vetting process, or it's not enough information is known. What does happen with those people? Do they get a second chance? Is there an appeal process because obviously upward mobility even, but also capability in terms of fighting a group like Boko Haram is enhanced if your best soldiers are included and they're also human rights vetted. So the appeals process would be another question. Also, delays. You mentioned, Colonel, that when you were commander, U.S. Army Security Assistance Training Management Organization, SATMO, I was faced with delays in deploying trainers due to incomplete vetting. If you could maybe, and others if you'd like, but if you could expand upon what kind of delays are we talking about? Is it a week, a month? Is it forever for some? How does that work in terms of your ability to match up a trainer with a group of soldiers that are in need of that training? And the INVEST program. If you could speak to, Ms. Margon, your point about the $5 million being far superior than the just under $3 million for the vetting process, and 13 people, I think, is the number that are at DRL. How important is that? Is that really a make or break issue? All of you might want to speak to that, but it seems to me that if you don't have the personnel deployed, the job doesn't get done. I know in our embassy in Nigeria, we do have, and I actually watched a vetting process happen, with the Google search and INVEST, and it was one they had already done, but it was just to show me how, because I had never seen it actually done, at least at that stage. And so how well, is there room for improvement there? Is the INVEST program, is that database accurate? Is it something that needs improvement, or is it just a work in progress, always going from good to getting better? So there's a couple of questions. And again, if you might want to touch on those policy tensions that, Ms. Blanchard, you talked about between the military and state and human rights community, and which can be benign tensions. Everyone's looking out for, or hopefully striving for the same ultimate goal here. And we need to learn from each other. But if you could perhaps address some of those questions.
Let me start with the first issue you raised, the Nigerian Army engaging with the ICRC, and I think that's a great development if it's happening. I think one of the trends that we see, not just in Nigeria, but in countries like Kenya and elsewhere where you have security force abuses, they often can be linked to breakdowns in the criminal justice system. You see frustration from local police, from the military, that individuals, be they Boko Haram or otherwise, are not going through the system. And as a result, particularly in Nigeria, we have seen massive detentions. These are not criminal justice detentions, but you're seeing thousands of people held in military facilities, particularly in the Northeast and Borno, in horrific conditions. So if ICRC can engage with the Nigerian military on how to improve those detention facilities, that's fantastic. A much bigger step would be to address the criminal justice system and its ability in countries like Nigeria and in East Africa to address processing of terrorism cases. On the issue of political tensions, this is a very difficult one, and there are a number of different tensions. It's not just between the military and the State Department. Often there are different parts of the military that see this differently, I think. You might find that the regional commands view things differently sometimes than special operations commanders who sort of are dealing with these countries on a more episodic basis. But there were also political tensions between posts, the embassy, be it both State Department and DoD officials and FBI officials and others who have to manage those day-to-day operations, managing the relationship with a host country, and people back here in Washington, D.C. who have to establish and implement the policies, including the Leahy laws. So there are tensions in terms of what your primary day job is, I guess. And in terms of, you mentioned Admiral McRaven's testimony last year. As I noted in my written testimony, he followed that up and said that there had been subsequently some very constructive engagement between DoD and State Department, and I think that as DoD has started to look more deeply at partner capacity building, they are really having, I think, some constructive dialogues with the State Department on how to improve the process, improve the vetting process, improve the discussion with the host governments on how to hold forces accountable, how to provide this human rights training. So I think that that is moving in a positive direction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Lauren about on the ICRC. The only thing I would say, if having dealt with the Nigerian Army, if they are putting it on their website, I assume it has the blessings from the highest level, and that means it's probably being checked. As we all know, soldiers do what they know that their officers are checking on. If they are taking it seriously, it's a positive movement forward. Trafficking, I understand what you were saying. I know that any military member going into the Southcom area, one of the things that's required for entry is to complete, it's listed under force protection, but it really is training on human trafficking. It's, once again, things that get checked, people do. If they're sitting down there, if that's a standard that becomes across the board, you'll see a greater emphasis from the military. Obviously, in the Southcom area of responsibility, human trafficking had been a concern for the Southcom commander, and he acted accordingly. Invest, I understand the State Department has 13 people doing it. Mr. Ricard's numbers was 530,000 units checked. With one boss and 12 workers, that is a horrendous workload. I defer to Mrs. Margon's bid about $5 million is much better than the $2 million. Obviously, it's a huge workload when you look at U.S. global engagement and having to validate a significant number of military units globally. And the last comment on vetting, for that particular mission, we were able to reschedule. U.S. Army Africa has no dedicated forces to it. It's a headquarters. The Army's solution for that is to implement on the global manning process is to earmark what they call the regionally aligned force. And every year, an Army brigade or a brigade equivalent is designated to the combatant commander to use for engagement opportunities. There is finite periods, that brigade commander or that unit commander has requirements that he or she has to meet. If they cannot deploy because the unit to be trained has not been vetted, it will depend on what else the United States Army has earmarked for that unit the next quarter or the next fiscal year. It might not ever reoccur. It could be an opportunity lost. It is very much dependent on the particular training being desired and when it's being scheduled.
Colonel, before going to Ms. Massimino, did you find that the names that were tendered to you were more likely to be pre-cleared and to be of soldiers who are likely to make it? So in a way, it's already having a laudatory effect on the Nigerian Army. And does it then begin to create a culture where human rights are the way forward for a soldier to really make it in the military, particularly if he's career-oriented?
The quality of U.S. training is superb. Most foreign nations, much broader than just Nigeria, select their best and brightest to come back to come to the United States to go to our schools. So it's definitely a career enhancing move to be selected to come to the United States under the IMET program. For training in theater, our soldiers are good. The quality of training that we give is good. Their soldiers benefit. So yes, it would be a career-enhancing move to it. As far as pre-clear on vetting, the Nigerians, when I was there, they understood what our requirements were. They knew far enough in advance, because we were talking battalion-level training, that we would check the names of every member of that battalion, and they had enough time to do it. And there was the political will at that time, and it was already addressed as, then peace support operations was very important to Abuja. ASO Rock did what was necessary and had the defense establishment do what was necessary to meet those terms. It's still, what is their political will to do so?
Thank you. Ms. Massimino.
Thank you. I don't have a lot to add to that. I want to also say that I don't know the content of the ICRC training for the Nigerian military, but I can't imagine that that's not a huge net plus to have that happening. So it's good to hear that. On trafficking, I'm really glad you brought that up. I don't know. I know that Leahy vetting sometimes includes things beyond what the law requires, but I'd be also curious to know, and I don't know whether engagement in trafficking by militaries is part of that. I don't think I've had a chance to talk to you yet about the fact that Human Rights First is launching a major campaign on anti-trafficking efforts. And at a recent meeting with General Kelly at Southcom at the Human Rights Roundtable, we had a specific discussion about the concerns that criminal networks engaging in human trafficking are diversified and also are, supporting terrorism, and it's becoming one large, weapons, people, drugs, and terrorism network, profit network. And so you could certainly make an argument that it ought to be, and I think we're going to be working closely with the U.S. military and others to try to ramp up efforts to identify those in foreign militaries that are engaging in trafficking. And then on the appeals process, Ms. Blanchard is far more knowledgeable about that than I am, but I did want to flag this, because it goes back to the importance of the duty to inform. That Leahy really, again, to get the full benefit, it's not really going to work unless we're telling the people who are being excluded why they're being excluded, and then start working with them. And I think there is sometimes a reluctance to do that, to make the relationship awkward, or we don't want to, the governments aren't going to like it. And that has sort of bled into sometimes kind of putting people in a strategic limbo where there's not a decision made. They don't want to make a negative decision, so they kind of just put in a closet and it never gets made, and that's not helpful either. So those are things that it would be good to find some ways to tackle.
Just very quickly, I think on the $5 million, my response will speak both to the $5 million in the Senate appropriations bill and the tensions. I think what's very important to remember about Leahy is that there's both an embassy side of this, so the U.S. embassies are taking care of this, and there's a Washington side. That can breed tensions not just along Civ Mill lines, but also from Post back to Washington. The $5 million, if you think about, there is at least $15 billion of security assistance globally. The centerpiece of the president's counterterrorism plans as we redeploy from Afghanistan is going to be this counterterrorism partnership fund. $5 million to do the vetting is, assuming it's legislated correctly with Leahy requirements, we would hope, is that's what needs to happen. It's very basic. It's a basic need to continue to expand the vetting pool that way. So it would go to basic things like supporting staff and computers in Washington, but also enabling the embassies, as I understand, to be better trained. It's desperately needed, and in the grand scheme, it's not a lot of money to help move the process forward and make it easier. So when defense attachés at Post have to do this vetting, it doesn't result in delays. It doesn't result in a misunderstanding and names dropped off of people who should be. The final thing that I would just mention is on the trafficking. I think as far as I understand, Leahy doesn't cover trafficking since we're looking at just the gross human rights violations. But what I think it's important to note is that Leahy often works hand in glove with other conditions that have been put on through various bills, appropriations, and otherwise. I think what we've seen in Indonesia and the Philippines is that Leahy has been the minimal basis, along with some other conditions that have helped move those countries in the right direction. And so in considering next steps on trafficking, it may not mean Leahy has to change per se, but that there are additional alternative expansions that can be made in other bills that can work in a correlated way.
You just add for your consideration, but I do think Section 502B and the language clearly would cover trafficking. You know, you look at the disappearance of persons, degrading treatment, cruel and inhuman. I mean, it's like ready-made for that. We'll ask the administration if they will include it, because it needs to be, I think, and get the tip office to weigh in as well if hopefully they'll agree. I do have one final question, and maybe, Ms. Blanchard, you answered it, but the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund, the $5 billion proposal, which had legislative language, and I read the language and was right from your testimony, which came up on June 26th, so just a few weeks ago, seems to not include the Leahy Amendment. I mean, notwithstanding language is usually, you know, red flags go up as soon as that language is anywhere. And it says, notwithstanding any limitation in the provision of law that would otherwise restrict the amount or recipients of such support. Does this bypass Leahy, or am I misreading the language?
It could potentially, if enacted in that way. And the difficulty with these notwithstanding provisions, we don't always know how they're implemented. So it is not always clear when the administration makes a policy decision to use that notwithstanding authority or not. But yes, potentially that could, if that makes it into law, leave ways to I don't want to use the term go around Leahy, but potentially. If I could make one comment, CRS doesn't make policy recommendations, but on the issue of resources for vetting, the new DoD definition of assistance, again, significantly broadens the amount of security assistance type activities that the State Department will now have to be vetting for, and DoD is still, to my understanding, working on the definition of what all that includes, but it's significantly larger than the training that they were vetting for previously. And if you then add on top of this the potential $5 billion new counterterrorism capacity building program, that's a massive potential amount of vetting that needs to be done.
Yes, I just wanted to underscore that that's also in our recommendations about the $4 billion for the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund, and it's a huge red flag. And I think it's hard to understand that language in any other way, but Congress has an opportunity. You should not let that go past. This is, if there's, any place where the Leahy vetting requirements should really be, doubled down on, it's in this new strategy that the United States has for countering terrorism through these partnerships. That makes Leahy even more critical than it's ever been. And if this goes through with that notwithstanding language in it, it risks really gutting these important human rights laws.
I would second that. It's a huge red flag for us, and very, very concerning. And it doesn't quite align with both what the president said in his West Point speech, and if you look at the Syrian opposition, nobody in the administration talks about this new fund to go to the Syrian opposition unless they're talking about the vetted Syrian opposition. And so the language that was sent up to Capitol Hill doesn't meet with the rhetoric that we've been hearing out of the administration. So it's very worrisome if it's implemented in that way.
I do have one final question, because I did ask about INVEST. The Google search INVEST, and thank you for your patience, especially with that very long voting that we had on the House floor. But and then the input that comes in from NGOs in the human rights community. Does the State Department and DRL in particular, as well as the embassies, have a sufficiently broad net to receive information from whistleblowers and people who, like a mayor who may know of something that needs to be told about what happened in his city, or an NGO that's indigenous in Nigeria? Are we getting enough by way of a channel of information in that third part of the information flow?
Sorry, I can talk about that a tiny bit since we do a lot of the work. I think, again, it depends. It's case by case. It depends a lot on both the international and local organizations, the context that the officers have, both the defense attaché and the political officers in the embassy. In the case of Nigeria, I think there's a lot of information flow for Human Rights Watch. One of the things we've been trying to do a better job on when we do our research and reporting is be as clear as we can about the units that we observe and to get the information that will enhance Leahy vetting, whether it be the name. We are told repeatedly from the State Department date of birth, which obviously is very hard to get, but we try to include as much specific, detailed information as we can to help that and to pass that through both the embassy channels and then back it up here in Washington. And we work with some of the local organizations to do that as well. And we encourage the embassy officers to reach out and to hold meetings in as much capacity as they can.
Yes.
Yeah, again, I would just underscore that there are these human rights defender principles that if they were fully implemented everywhere, it would, there's nothing about them that specifically relates to Leahy, but it would in essence make it the practice of the U.S. government to establish the kinds and depths of relationships with NGOs in these countries that would produce more detailed information that would make the Leahy vetting process work better.
Yes.
One comment on the INVEST system. I think this online database is an incredible tool. You mentioned the issue of trafficking earlier. From my understanding, the State Department is trying to input a variety of other, not necessarily gross human rights abuse related information, including on corruption and trafficking and other serious concerns on units when they have that information. But then, of course, that goes back to the issue of time and resources to actually put that information into the system. So again, going back to the 13 people staffing this in headquarters.
I want to thank all of you for your extraordinarily incisive testimony, the expertise that you have brought to the subcommittee. This will be widely shared with my colleagues. So thank you so very much, because I think it comes at a very, very important pivotal point. And our hope is that more service members will be trained to be effective, but also adequately and robustly vetted for human rights abuses, so that these troops are the kind of people we can be proud of, and Nigerians and others in other countries can be proud of. I thank you, and the hearing is adjourned.